Hi, everybody. It's good to be here again. I can't believe it's 3 years since the last one. And guess what we were talking about then? But there is a fairly good chance that this is the Brexit endgame this time. When I was asked to be the speaker, I did for a moment think, given the dysfunctional nature of UK politics, that I was being asked to replace John Bercow. But I'm even more delighted to be here. What I'd like to do is to take you through a couple of things. Clearly, Brexit is the key topic. But I'd also like to talk about some of the implications of what happens if there isn't a deal, i.e. if there's a no-deal Brexit. I'd actually like to talk about the economy as well and economic prospects and some of the main factors which are affecting the UK. Then I'd like to wrap up with a few conclusions. Very open to questions and answers at the end as well. So, without further ado, let's go. Starting on Brexit, I was remembering the good old days of 2012 when the government's bungled attempt to introduce VAT on hot Cornish pasties was termed an omni-shambles. I don't think an adjective has actually been concocted to describe what's been going on over the past 3.5 years. And perhaps Investec should have a competition, and the winner can win a prize. But it certainly kept everybody busy over that period. Let's see where we are on the Brexit process. I think that's always a good starting point. It's a headline writer's dream that the current leaving date is still the 31st of October. You can imagine all the Halloween headlines. And that's actually the third deadline for the UK's EU membership. There's a lot of talk about legislation stopping a no-deal Brexit. That's very misleading. A no-deal Brexit is the default outturn on the 31st of October. Even now, something has to change for that not to be the case. And indeed, the Prime Minister's strategy was that if we can convince everybody that nobody can stop a no-deal, then we'll get a better agreement with the rest of the EU. In the event, Boris ran into a number of problems. During the first week of Parliament meeting after the summer recess, it passed an Act of Parliament to force the government to ask for an extension, a 3-month extension, to the UK's membership of the EU to the 31st of January, if a deal with the EU is not agreed by the 19th of October. Now, of course, Boris has said, we are leaving, do or die, on the 31st of October, and he has repeatedly maintained that he will not go to Brussels to ask for an extension if events play in that direction. It's not clear as to what he will do if that set of circumstances comes to pass. The other question is, of course, that for an extension, all of the EU 27 countries have to agree to the UK's request. And there is some talk that perhaps the French would refuse our request. Now, we don't think that's the case. I spent some time in Berlin speaking to policymakers and journalists as well, and it's very likely, we think, that if it comes to the point where the UK asks for an extension, the EU will grant that 3 months. And we do think, because of that a no-deal departure on the 31st of October is unlikely. Now, there's a lot of talk about prorogation at the moment. Indeed, the Supreme Court is due to deliver its verdict, believe it or not, at 10:30 this morning on whether that's legal or not. Prorogation itself is only the suspension of Parliament. It usually happens every year to end a parliamentary session, and the new parliamentary session starts with the Queen's speech. Now, this session is an unusually long one. It's been running since June 2017, effectively since the last election. And you normally get Parliament in recess for 3 or 4 weeks anyway at this time of year because of the political conference, party conference season. Now, our reading of the situation is that Boris was fearing that Parliament would not pass a motion for a recess and that he'd face another 3 or 4 weeks of debate on Brexit. What he's done effectively is go for a 35-day prorogation, and if you compare the recesses in previous years, that's about 9 or 10 days longer. You also need another 3 days of parliamentary time. Number one, for the Queen's speech itself, and 2 days for the Queen's speech debate. So Boris has tried to compress the amount of parliamentary time to, number one, prevent debate on Brexit, or to restrict it, and also to try and prevent Parliament from legislating for an extension. Now, of course, that failed during the first week of the Parliament came back from recess. We'll hear, as I say, a Supreme Court verdict at 10:30 on whether the prorogation was legal or not. The other thing the Prime Minister tried to do was to set an early date for a general election. Why did he do that? Well, when he came back to Parliament, again, he was trying to stop having to ask for a Brexit extension, if that's what it came to. He was looking for a 15th of October election date, and had that taken place and had the Tories had a big win, he would have been able to overturn the Act which was passed in early September and actually leave on the 31st of October, come what may. There's a question which has been going around for a while. Does Boris Johnson want to leave the EU without a deal? Now, we actually don't think that he does. He wants a deal because he realises the disruption to the economy that leaving without a deal would entail. But at the same time, we think that he's a lot more willing than Theresa May to do this if it comes to it. Now, in terms of the election, I'll speak a bit more about politics in a sec, but the election dynamics are very, very fluid, and they will change from day to day. Now, there's been a lot of animosity expressed towards Parliament for what's gone on over the past few weeks. There's been a lot of anger expressed at the government. And indeed, I think this picture here was taken on a so-called People's March a few months ago. One of my colleagues in my team actually objected to this being included in the pack because they thought that it was slightly unfair to IKEA. But anyway, we all have our opinions on that. Let's have a look at what the existing deal is, what has been agreed at negotiator level, excuse me, indeed by Theresa May's government. The deal's in two parts. You've got number one is the Withdrawal Agreement. That deals with the leaving arrangements, including the contentious Northern Ireland backstop. And that's 585 pages of legal text. The second bit is called the Political Declaration. That deals with the future relationship between the UK and the EU. And that's only a very broad, very vague document, and that runs to 26 pages. Now, if a deal's agreed, the UK would leave the EU, and then it would be in a transition period until the end of 2020. Now, this is critical because it means that even though the UK would have left the EU, the relationship between Britain and the European Union would remain virtually identical to how it is at the moment. And there is the option to extend that by 2 years as a part in the Withdrawal Agreement. Now, what Theresa May was trying to do when she was Prime Minister was to try and seek what's called a customs sharing agreement with the EU to try and maintain the frictionless trade that Britain has with the European Union, and also at the same time to strike third-party deals with third-party countries. It was actually quite clever, but it was never actually fully agreed by the EU, and there's only a brief allusion to it in the Political Declaration. Now, the contentious part of the Withdrawal Agreement is the backstop. Now, the backstop on Northern Ireland is designed so that if the long-term trading arrangements between the UK and the EU have to necessitate some sort of checks, either customs checks or regulatory checks between the UK and the EU, the backstop is designed to keep the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland open to maintain the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement. And the way that that would work is that the whole of the United Kingdom would remain in a customs union with the EU, and also Northern Ireland would be in a partial regulatory agreement or alignment with the European Union. Now, what are the problems with that? There are several. Number one, a concern on the right of the Conservative Party is that there are worries that the UK will be trapped in the backstop indefinitely. There is no unilateral mechanism that the UK can invoke to leave. That has to be determined by a joint committee. The second point, and this is the DUP's main objection is that Northern Ireland is treated differently from the rest of Great Britain, despite that we're one sovereign nation. You have to have a certain number of checks going east-west, for example, from Stranraer to Larne. And a third issue is that the political declaration, the part of the agreement that deals with the future relationship, is only a vague outline of the future arrangements, and that the UK arguably should have looked for something more concrete. Now, the government's had very little room for manoeuvre here because of its supply and confidence agreement with the DUP, and there were 3 attempts that May tried to get the deal through Parliament with. There was one standalone withdrawal agreement vote, which is the third vote. The other 2 were on the full deal. And they all were defeated heavily. The first one, I think, lost by 230 votes. The most recent one, at the end of March, lost by 58 votes. But no luck in getting that through Parliament. In terms of the current politics, what sort of deal is Boris trying to push through? Now, the Prime Minister's insisted that the Irish backstop has to go. It's completely unacceptable. Now, of course, the EU's view is that it's completely united, that you need some fallback arrangement to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland, and secondly, also to protect the EU single market. If the UK has free trade deals with other countries, if there are no checks or no mechanism to stop goods coming in, then they could come in through the back door and through the UK. So the EU is insisting that there has to be some sort of backstop. And the most recent talk has been on an all-island backstop. And that would work by having an alignment on rules on food and agriculture and perhaps other goods as well. So Northern Ireland is then aligned with the rest of the EU. And also, there's been some talk of the Northern Ireland being in a customs union for a while with the EU, but again, the government has said that's completely unacceptable. And it's said to the EU, well, you'll have to have customs checks away from the Irish border. So we've made progress, but there's nothing at all that's legally operable in terms of what's being spoken about. That's the direction of the deal, but we really can't rule out something changing, either through an election taking place, which would bring out a second referendum or a revocation of Article 50 even. It's still looking very, very uncertain. Now, if we look at the political situation, the Tory DUP majority has been very, very slender. And that's why Theresa May called the election for 2017. She was hoping to increase her majority, but in the end, of course, she blew it. Now, the majority's gone due to a by-election. In the vote on the 3-month extension, 21 Tory rebels had the Conservative whip removed. We've had another resignation. So if you look at the parliamentary arithmetic at the moment, the government is 45 short of a majority. It seems like a bit of an obvious point to make, but that is completely unsustainable. Minority governments can limp on for a number of years, but that's only if you're in a minority of a couple. This situation will have to change, either through a reconciliation within the Parliamentary Tory party, or you're likely to have an election. And an election is pretty likely, we think, within the next few months. But it's also possible that before that, you get the government delivering Brexit with a deal. So let's have a look at Northern Ireland. What's the position of the DUP? Because this is critical. The DUP in each of the 3 meaningful votes has voted against the government. There are 10 DUP MPs. Recently, the party has shown some signs of softening its stance. Why is that? Well, there are 3 reasons. Firstly, the DUP doesn't want a no-deal Brexit because it is aware that it would harm the Northern Irish economy. And its backers are indeed small Northern Irish businesses and the agricultural sector. Number 2, they realise their position's weaker. The government's no longer dependent on them for their majority because it doesn't have one. So the parliamentary arithmetic has been a dynamic hit. And thirdly, there was an Ashcroft poll a couple of weeks ago that showed a narrow majority for reunification with the Republic of Ireland within Northern Ireland. And that's a red rag to a bull as far as the loyalist community is concerned. So it is softening its stance. And if you were to have a fourth meaningful vote in the Commons and the DUP supported it, you could probably bring a few right-wing Tories on board as well. And then that 58 majority becomes smaller. It becomes feasible. It's not impossible. Let's have a quick look at what no deal might mean in terms of the economy. And I'll talk about the government's worst case no deal Brexit assumptions here, the Operation Yellowhammer. As you will all know, the UK involves frictionless trade with the EU, which means you don't have customs checks, you don't have regulatory checks, you don't have any tariffs either going in or going out of the EU, and a whole load of other regulations, some very complex regulations, are uniform across all 28 countries. On a no-deal situation, all that falls away. And from an economic case, you're looking at customs checks and regulatory checks across the borders, as well as facing tariffs for exporters to the EU, and goods coming in theory, from the EU would also face UK tariffs. Now, one of the big points that you'll be aware of is the importance of the point of Dover. You get something like 2.5 million trucks that go through Dover every year. Do the maths. If you have to even have a 2-minute check on each truck that goes through, you have got huge log jams at the ports there. And Operation Yellowhammer, the government's contingency plan, reckons that the cross-channel flow could be reduced by about 50% for at least 3 months before the flow rate improves to perhaps 70%. And what it's talked about is fresh food supplies decreasing. It's talked about perhaps a shortage of medicines. Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, was joking a few months ago about being the biggest purchaser of fridges in the UK. This government's talked about possible public disorder as well, with protests and counter-protests taking place, and also border delays disrupting fuel supplies. You know, it doesn't look great. And in terms of what the Bank of England has been saying in terms of the economy, it's been talking about a potential sharp recession, with, at the end of last year, it was suggesting that GDP or economic activity could fall by up to 8%, unemployment rising and inflation rising. And inflation would rise probably because the exchange rate would fall, sterling would be weaker, and because the UK might plan to place tariffs on imports coming in from the EU. Now, because of various contingency arrangements, the latest Bank of England numbers look a bit more modest, but even so, when the economy contracts by 5.5%, potentially, that's still not a pretty situation. Now, I have to say that this is a worst-case scenario. It's not a central view, but the authorities are right, I think, to be planning some arrangements. I'll just run through these very quickly. What sort of mitigating measures has the government been introducing? Number one, there's a temporary tariff regime. In theory, what the government would do if we left without a deal would be to impose the EU's WTO, the World Trade Organization, tariff roster on imports coming into the UK. So in theory, the tariff on cars would be 10%, tariff on food would average 22%. What it said would be that instead of doing that, it will set all tariff rates for areas where we don't have a trade agreement at zero for 87% of UK imports. Now, the main exceptions here are actually food and cars, but it realises that if you impose tariffs on imports, that's really going to hurt the UK consumer. And it would do this for about a year while it'd be consulting what to do. In the meantime, the UK benefits from free trade with the EU. The EU accounts for about half of UK exports. In addition to that, we benefit from trade deals with third-party countries signed up with the EU. And what the government's been trying to do is to roll those trade deals over. And so far you've got about 14 which have been signed or agreed in principle, and they represent something like 8% of total trade. So the government is working towards that. The other thing which we get are what's called TSPs, or transitional simplified procedures. Under a no-deal situation, importers would be allowed to take their goods without immediately informing HMRC. You'd have a simplified declaration procedure, but you first need to register to use those TSPs. Another factor is that the government has said that businesses will need what's called an EORI registration, which is the Economic Operator Registration Identification. I'll just go through this very quickly. What the government's trying to do is to get VAT-registered firms registered automatically, again, to mitigate the effects of hold-ups at port. And other permits will be necessary as well. So it's a highly complex situation. The government is doing its best to ease the potential logjams. I think this is not a joking matter, but you've had the lady Sarah Thomas that swam the channel 4 times in a row. There's a little bit of black humour about how we're going to get necessary imports into the UK. That's a Matt cartoon from the Telegraph the other day. Quick look at the parliamentary arithmetic. The font on this is a bit small, but it shows the extent to which the government is short of a majority. What you've got at the bottom is the Conservative and the DUP total, which comes to 297 seats. If you exclude the 4 speakers and deputy speakers and the 7 Sinn Féin MPs that don't take up their seats, you need 320 seats for a majority. You can see where the government might be able to get some help here. You've got 24 independent Conservative MPs that have either resigned or lost the whip. They may be able to rely on 23 of them. If it goes to a vote in Parliament, really, on the 4th meaningful vote on a deal, the critical factor is Labour MPs. Over the last 3 votes, 5 Labour MPs have voted for a deal with the government. There are some indications that between 20 and 50 might be persuaded to change their minds on that. And that's really the mechanism whereby if you agree a deal with the EU, you might be able to get it through Parliament. But in the meantime, you're very vulnerable to a vote of no confidence because you're 45 short of majority. Quick look at where the economy is. First chart is a chart of economic growth. We have monthly economic growth, or GDP numbers. They're very volatile. So what we've done here is we've smoothed it. We've taken the 3-month average and compared it with the previous 3 months. And that's what the black line shows you there. The bars represent the contributions from the sectors. Yellow represents the service sector. The blue is the industrial production sector, including manufacturing. Red is the construction sector. And what you see there, the chart goes from the start of 2016. From mid-2018, what you've got is a slowdown in the economy. You've got a little bit of a rally in the manufacturing sector in February, March time, when businesses were ramping up production to guard against the no deal. And what you've seen there is manufacturing contracting as it's beginning to run its stockpiles down. To the right of the line, you've got our forecast, and what you've had is a stronger outturn for July. It doesn't quite show through in the moving averages. But we think that the talk that we've had about an immediate recession is overdone, if you look at the higher frequency numbers. And what we're projecting until early next year is the economy posting slowish growth, but growth nonetheless. Now, we think that Brexit gets blamed perhaps for too much of the woes of the UK economy. But one area where Brexit, to our minds, is clearly responsible for weakness is in business investment. When I speak to our clients on the corporate space, they tell me, quite logically, that they don't want to commit tens or hundreds of millions of pounds to new plants in the UK because they don't know what the trading relationship between the UK and the EU will be over the longer term. And indeed, business investment has been weak now for a good year and a half or more. And this is what this chart shows. The blue bars are quarter-on-quarter change in business investment. Again, we've taken this chart from 2016. The red line compares the current quarter with a year ago. And you can see from the beginning of 2018, business investment has been falling over that period. And we think that's Brexit related. One area which is not to do with the UK's relationship with the EU is what's happening in the global economy. And that's got more to do with trade wars between China and the US. And what we've got here is a proxy for world GDP growth every quarter. You don't have high-frequency world economic growth numbers, so we've taken the largest 12 economies, put their numbers together, and they cover about 2/3 of the world economy. And that's the purple line there, and that shows you the change on the year. And you can see there from effectively spring 2018 that you've had a slowdown in world economic growth. Now, to check more recent data, what we've done is we've mapped that with a key survey called the Global PMI, the Global Purchasing Managers Index, which is a fairly good track, we think, of world economic activity, and that's the orange line. And the orange line there shows you really you've had no acceleration, if anything, a little bit of a deceleration from the second quarter of the year. And indeed, we do think that the world economy is slowing down. Does trade matter? Yes, it does. The chart here shows you the difference in growth, according to our forecasts, between this year and last year. So if you've got a stronger economy, it's above the zero line on the y-axis. There's only one economy there. If you've got a weaker economy this year, you're going further down below the zero line. And what we've done here is to compare it against the openness of each economy, i.e. exports and imports as a proportion of GDP. And what that shows is that the more open the economy, the bigger the slowdown. And that's really a product of the tariff wars between the US and China, and there's been a consequent slowdown in the global economy. So just to give a few lines on the economic perspective here, Trump started off the tariff war in the middle of last year. You've had additional tariffs on something like $500 billion of American imports of Chinese goods. You've had a retaliation from Beijing, and world trade is actually now falling. It's not just slowing down, it's falling. And that's having a particularly marked effect on Asian economies and economies such as Germany, which are very open. You've now got US-China trade talks underway at negotiator level. At a top level, they're set to resume in Washington in early October. But there are big differences between the two parties. And we think that although there's progress, it's going to be very, very slow over the next year or two. And what that means, we think, for the global economy is that you're likely to get global economic growth of below 3% for the first time since 2009, i.e. the slowest year of global economic growth since the aftermath of the global recession. What have the authorities been doing about it? Well, you've had 45 central banks around the world actually cutting interest rates in response so far this year. And there's more talk of fiscal stimulus. Now, the Bank of England hasn't cut rates, and we don't think will cut rates, but we've had some higher public spending, which came through from Philip Hammond's last two budgets, and indeed, Sajid Javid, the current Chancellor, announced a big increase in spending for 2020. Now, a couple of UK-specific points. We think that if we do get a decent Brexit deal, that will begin to unlock that weak business investment which we've had. We're looking at economic growth this year of just over 1% and perhaps a little bit firmer next year. Interest rates, official interest rates, i.e. the bank rate, are currently 0.75%. We don't see rates going up at all until 2021. However, if there's a no deal, previously the Bank of England has been talking about perhaps interest rates moving in either direction. It's now softened its line slightly and said, well, if there's no deal and the economy tanks, we're more likely to get a cut in rates. Okay, a couple of further thoughts. The first point is that the UK outlook is not just dependent on Brexit. The world economy has a big say in the direction. Our base case, will there be a deal? We think there's probably approaching a 60% chance that we'll get a deal, 40% chance of a no deal, and 2% one of those other left field options I talked about earlier. We're hopeful but not confident that we'll get a deal struck in time for the European Summit on the 18th of October, and it gets a majority in Parliament. The DUP may well fall into line. If you get a number of Labour MPs voting for it, then it goes through. Now, the technical point is that if you want to leave the EU by the 31st of October, that timetable is really, really challenging. And it's challenging because you not only need to get that meaningful vote through, you have to get the legal legislation through known as the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, or the WAB. And that's going to take time. So our view is that you're going to need some sort of extension in any case to get all that through Parliament, even if you get a deal agreed with the EU by mid-October. Now, the fourth meaningful vote, we suspect, might result in the Queen's Speech debate being moved, which is the 21st, 22nd of October. We have to make a point that even if the Northern Ireland backstop is sorted out, that doesn't fix logjams at the Channel. It does in the short term because we're in a transition period until the end of 2020. After that, you need a new arrangement, so be careful about that. And in terms of opinion polls, at the moment, you've got the Tories something like 10% ahead of Labour. Now, if all the votes were to change in a uniform way across the country, i.e. you had a uniform national swing, the Tories would get a big majority from that. But we all know there's going to be a very nuanced vote with Leave and Remain playing a big part in the way that people vote. And the Conservatives are actually concerned about their seats in London, in the rest of the southeast of England, the southwest of England, and Scotland. So they are very concerned, and I think the Prime Minister's strategy is to try and hold the election after we leave the EU to neutralise the Brexit party and to get most of his votes, and then fight Jeremy Corbyn perhaps in the spring. But whether Parliament will allow him to wait that long is really a moot point. I hope I've not talked for too long. Thank you very much, and I'm more than happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip.